When Scripture fails to reveal any evidence that Christmas cannot be celebrated, the anti-Christmas crowd turns to history and attempts to show that Christmas traditions descend directly from pagan practices. Therefore, that means they're evil and must be avoided, so we do not mimic pagan practices. But there is not a lot of good reasoning behind this. The basic argument is, pagans did X. Christian practice Y, which means something different, is similar to X, therefore Y is evil. If you just look at this reasoning, you will see how terrible it is, simply for the fact that harmless practices, whatever they appear to be, are not immoral. It is the motive behind the practice that is the real problem. For example, let's say you're having a bonfire with your friends or a church group, and someone came over and told you to stop, simply for the reason that pagans have used bonfires in their practices. The obvious reply is, but we are not setting a fire to worship a pagan god. We're just enjoying time around a fire together. See, just because something looks similar to a pagan practice, that doesn't mean that is what someone is actually doing. So if a pagan can use a bonfire, and it doesn't mean a Christian cannot, then why would it matter if pagans have decorated pine trees? Another thing to remember is, if you really think you can't decorate with anything a pagan may have used for their worship, then you need to follow through and take down any pictures you might have up of your parents or your grandparents, because many pagans worship their ancestors. So using the logic of the anti-holiday crowd, anytime you hang up a picture of your ancestors, you are mimicking pagan worship of ancestors. In reality, and I think we can all agree, if you hang up a picture of your grandparents, that doesn't mean you're worshiping like a pagan did. And the same applies with Christmas decorations. Just because they possibly were used by pagans, that doesn't make them evil. In fact, there are many things believers in God have used that have also been used by pagans. And if you just look at the examples, you can see how ridiculous it is to reject Christmas traditions just because it may have come from paganism. Take a look at this. It is a six-pointed star, and when people see it, they think of Judaism, the Star of David, or the nation of Israel. Well, that is true, but the same shape is also used in paganism, and may have been used in ancient Egyptian sorcery. Does that mean this means pagan sorcery is at work? Of course not. Just different groups using the same symbol. It is the meaning we put behind the symbol, not the symbol itself. And the simple fact that just because a pagan may have used something, that doesn't taint it forever. But there are even better examples closer to home. For example, Jesus is referred to in the New Testament as King of Kings, but this phrase actually comes from pagans, who used to call the kings of Babylon, and later the kings of Persia, the King of Kings. So here we have a clear example of Christians taking a phrase directly from paganism and applying it to Jesus. Now some may object that Jesus is the original King of Kings, so technically the pagans stole it from the true God, and I would reply that is exactly my point. Every symbol or object pagans have used was originally created by God for good. So if the New Testament writers can use this phrase, even though it was applied to pagan kings, then we can also use things that pagans have used in the past, and there is no sin in doing so. Let's look at an even bigger example. It has been commonly known by scholars that the book of Proverbs took heavily from an Egyptian book known as the Instruction of Amenemop. This would mean King Solomon read a pagan book of wisdom and took direct sayings from him. Kind of put some context on that verse that says, "Learn not the ways of the heathen," that the anti-holiday crowd loves to take out of context so much. But does this mean the book of Proverbs is evil? Of course not. King Solomon simply found wisdom where it was and preserved it for his people to read as well. Just because it was originally written by a pagan, that doesn't mean it is evil or that it cannot be learned from. Solomon seemed to think it was okay, and there is nothing wrong with taking something a pagan wrote or used and learning from it. And just because a pagan may have used a tree for a ritual, that doesn't mean Christians cannot use one for a holiday tradition. No one is worshiping the tree or using it in any type of ritual. This type of behavior of reclaiming things that were once used by pagans actually comes from Scripture itself. 1 Corinthians 15 says, "For he must reign until he has put all enemies under his feet. The last enemy to be destroyed is death. For God has put all things in subjection under his feet." But when he says all things are put in subjection, it is plain that he is accepted, who put all things in subjection under him. When all things are subjected to him, then the Son himself will also be subjected to him, who put all things in subjection under him, that God may be all in all. Paul said Christ will reign until all things are subjected to him. Early Christians saw a part of this being practices and objects pagans use as well. If a pagan used something to honor a pagan god, Christians could claim it for Christ and subject it under him. A good example can be seen in this obelisk at the Vatican courtyard. Conspiracy theorists love to point out it as a pagan symbol, and this proves the Catholic Church worships the devil. But they do it while ignoring the history behind it. The obelisk was originally moved to Rome by Caligula in 37 AD. In 1586, Pope Sixtus rededicated it as a symbol of humanity reaching up to Christ. The pagan dedications were replaced and a cross was added to it. You can read this in a real scholarly source. Likewise, even if Christmas traditions are pagan, we don't have to worry. We can simply be reclaiming them for Christ and using them for good. But is there any actual evidence Christmas traditions are pagan? Well, despite the popular myth, you might be surprised to find out there is no real evidence to connect Christmas traditions to paganism. The biggest issue that comes up is the date of December 25th. I can't tell you how many people I hear claim this date was selected for pagan reasons. Even some pro-Christmas Christians buy into it. First, as we already stated, even if the date was selected to overtake a pagan holiday, it can just be seen as a time when Christians worked to reclaim this day for Christ. But it actually wasn't. A common argument is Christmas was placed on December 25th to match pagan holidays already celebrated on that day, so the church could blend Christmas with pagan customs. The leading candidate is the holiday of Sola Victus. But the problem is the earliest inscription of Sola Victus doesn't mention the day it was celebrated. It was not until around the middle of the 4th century that anyone dated Sola Victus to December 25th. So it is equally possible pagans moved their celebration to December 25th to compete with Christians who were in power by this time. In fact, scholar Thomas Taylor says it is more likely the Roman Emperor Aurelian placed Sola Victus on December 25th to compete with the growing rate of Christianity, rather than the other way around. Another attempt is to claim Christmas was meant to be blended with the festival of Saturnalia. But the 5th century author, Macrobius, says Saturnalia was celebrated 14 days before January began, which works out to December 17th. He also says the festival would last a max of only 3 days. So it was not actually celebrated on December 25th. Some attempt to try and use the festival of Brumalia, but this ran from late November to December 17th. So again, this was not celebrated on December 25th. And therefore we have no evidence the date of Christmas was selected because of pagan holidays. All other references to pagan deities being born on the winter solstice date to well after the 4th century. Textual evidence suggests Christmas was celebrated on December 25th long before Constantine or certain pagan celebrations. In 386 AD, John Chrysostom says celebrating Christmas on December 25th was a long-time tradition. The Philocalian calendar lists Christmas as an established church holiday. Thomas Taylor makes a convincing argument from evidence in a sermon of St. Augustine, which states an early heretical group called the Donatists failed to keep the introduction of later feasts, but clung to traditions before their split from the church around 311 AD. One of the feasts they kept was the celebration of Christmas on December 25th, indicating the use of this date was established before the split. And there is some textual evidence Hippolytus may have said Christmas was on December 25th at the beginning of the 3rd century. So it doesn't seem the date came from paganism, and evidence suggests it was well established from the beginning of the 4th century. So where did the date come from? In the days of the early church, many believed Jesus would die on the same day he was conceived. So if you take the time of his crucifixion and count forward 9 months, you get December 25th. Were they right to conclude Jesus was born on this day? Well, we really don't know. But the point is December 25th was not chosen for pagan reasons, but from early Christian calculations and theories. What about long-time Christmas traditions, like Christmas trees, Santa, and Christmas wreaths? Surely these come from paganism. Well, if they were, I've not seen any evidence of it, and vague similarities don't cut it. reading actual history books reveals we are not sure where the Christmas tree came from. Some say it originally came from St. Boniface, when he cut down the oak tree dedicated to Thor. When he wasn't killed by lightning, he pointed to the fir tree and dedicated it to Christ. Some scholars think Christmas trees morphed from a paradise tree, which were used in Adam and Eve plays in the 1500s. The plays were typically held on December 24th. There is even an account which credits the Christmas tree to Martin Luther. Either way, the practice of decorating an evergreen tree on December 25th began long after pagan rituals died out, so there is no evidence of a direct link. It is most likely people like to decorate the tree that could survive the harshness of winter. Paradise trees were already featured on Christmas Eve and were composed of a fir tree with red apples hanging from the branches. People probably began associating the decorated tree with the holiday season, and bringing an evergreen tree into your house when the dead of winter had set in would liven people's spirits and remind them of the Garden of Eden paradise that Christ came to restore. What about old Saint Nick? Surely he is a pagan representation of some sort of ancient god. Well, no. Santa Claus is an Americanized version of Sinterklaas, which is the Dutch shortened version of Saint Nicholas. His feast was celebrated on December 6th, and he was a very well-loved saint even after the Protestant Reformation because of the legends of him helping children. After the American Revolution, many New Yorkers wanted to connect to their Dutch roots and began promoting the patron saint. It was then Saint Nicholas was first called Santa Claus and placed in the red suit to Americanize him. Many things were added and changed about Saint Nicholas to make him more Americanized and look less like a Catholic saint. A few years later in 1821, the sleigh, reindeer, and bringing gifts from the North Pole were added. It was around this time Christmas had become a drunken celebration for men to wreak havoc around the city, and many wanted Christmas to become a more family-centered holiday. Santa Claus, the gift-giving saint, was moved to appear on Christmas Eve rather than December 6th to help teach this way of celebrating Christmas. So no pagan tradition stolen here, just a Dutch saint turned into an American. What about the Christmas wreath? Well, wreaths have been used in several different cultures for several different reasons. Yes, some were used in rituals to honor pagan gods, but so what? There is no evidence Christmas wreaths were taken from that, just like there is no evidence wedding or funeral wreaths were either. They are just simply a popular and easy decoration to make, which is why they are used in several different types of celebrations and festivals. Again, the problem is how the anti-Christmas crowd cannot separate the object from its context, and how they lack the ability to realize God cares more about your heart and motive than the object in your hand. If you're a Christian, you believe God cleanses us as sinners and makes us new in His presence. So why can't God cleanse a calendar day, a tree, a custom, or anything a pagan may have touched? A little more is needed than finding vague similarities to paganism, or making up similarities for that matter, and concluding it is a horrendous sin to even look remotely like them. Do some research and stop living in fear. God does not lead in fear, so have a guilt-free holiday and Merry Christmas from Inspiring Philosophy Ministries.